If you ever get the feeling you are being hunted by wolves, it's already too late. Dion remembered his second grade teacher saying those words a long time ago when trying to explain how to hook someone who is reading a story. It had seemed kind of silly back to him then, almost 7 years ago. Now, it was terrifyingly real. He knew that there was at least one wolf following him, and where there was one, there was usually a few more. He hadn't seen it yet, not fully. A bit of gray off in the distance, a dash of white disappearing into the undergrowth. That is all the evidence he had so far that he was being followed. That, and the growing sense of dread. The woods were way too quiet. Every tiny noise he made, from the crunch of a leaf to the snap of a twig, sounded 10 times louder than normal. He was making noise, but whatever was following him was not. No matter how hard he strained his ears to listen, he heard nothing. "What should I do?" he whispered to himself. "Stop and think. What should I do?" He had no time for panic if he wanted to live, so he dug deep into his brain, trying to figure out what his next move would be. He knew that his chances of getting out of this alive were small, but he was too strong to just give up. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. Dion thought about his surroundings. The wolves would obviously be more used to running through the woods than he would be. They were also faster and could run for a longer time than he could. Running uphill would be bad for him, but not for the wolves, and he was pretty sure that they could run down a hill just fine. "I need to get somewhere different," he thought. "I need to get out of these trees." In his mind, Dion drew a map of where he was. The campground and safety were about 2 miles away. He could never run that far without the wolves catching up to him. He also did not know how many wolves were following him. He did not want to lead a large pack of savage animals close to where his family, especially his baby sister, might be caught. The main highway was closer, but it was all uphill from where he was, and, as best as he could tell, it was on the other side of the wolves that might be hunting him. That left him with only one other option: the river. The silence around him was broken by the sound of a wolf howl. Not the lonely wolf howl you sometimes hear at night. This howl was a challenge and a summons. It went on for a long time, freezing Dion's blood in his veins and making his heart race. Then it ended as suddenly as it had begun. The silence returned, and both Dion and whatever was out there in the trees waited. Time stood still. Salty sweat ran down Dion's brow and into his eyes. His lungs demanded oxygen, but he held his breath, waiting. Then the answer came. From 3 different directions came more howls. There was no doubt about it now. He was being hunted, and he only had minutes to live unless he did something. None of the howls came from the direction of the river. The time for waiting was over. The time for planning had passed. Without any more thought, he ran. The river was downhill, which made running a little easier. However, he was still in the woods and had to dodge low branches and jump over fallen logs, all while trying not to run head first into a tree. There was no point in trying to hide now. There was only escape. He could hear them now, somewhere behind him. They were chasing him, but were still eerily quiet. Every once in a while, he heard a quick bark or a snarl, but other than that, it was just the sound of their paws galloping through the underbrush. He did not know how many of them were chasing him, and he dared not stop to count. It doesn't matter anyway, he thought as he jumped over a rock. One would be enough. He could see the river now. It was less than 100 feet away. He could also hear the wolves behind him getting closer. He was not sure, but he thought he could hear the closest one panting. It didn't seem to be breathing nearly as hard as Dion was. He reached the bottom of the hill and the edge of the river, and his heart sank. The river was wide, but it was obviously not very deep. He could see large, flat rocks in the river, their tops barely covered with water. He could easily hop from rock to rock to get all the way across, but that meant the wolves could too. But still, he had to try. Without missing a beat, he jumped and landed on the nearest rock. He kept running. Behind him there were some barks as the wolves had to take a moment to decide what to do, but he knew that the shallow water would buy him only a few seconds at best. He ran downstream. The only other choice now was to run up the riverbanks, and they were cluttered with trees and brush that would only slow him down. Running across the rocks, splashing water from the shallow puddles would have been fun on any other day. Dion had always loved running, and was good enough at cross-country that he made the team every year and usually got at least a ribbon at the end of the season. But good enough was not going to be nearly enough to outrun a pack of wolves. He knew that a wolf can run at least 40 miles per hour when chasing prey. Dion also knew that even on his best day he could only run half that fast, and only for a few seconds. His lungs were burning and his legs were begging him to stop. Even his arms were sore from the wild swinging he had to do as he used them to keep balance hopping across rocks. It began to sink in that he was not going to make it. There was nothing and no one that could save him now. The wolves were testing him, trying to figure out how much of a fight he would put up. When they knew that he was not strong enough to fight back, the closest one would leap and take Dion down. He saw movement out of the corner of each eye. There was a wolf on each side of them, keeping pace, water splashing around their paws, glittering silver in the bright sun. They were going to surround him, he guessed, just to make sure that their prey did not get away. Like most people at the end of their life, he wished that he could see his family just one more time, play one more game of catch with Dad, bake brownies one last time with Mom, and read one last bedtime story to Adriana, his baby sister. He realized he would not even get to see her grow old enough to be annoying. He decided to try, at least for a few minutes longer, to keep running. For his mom and his dad, and for Adriana, he dug down deep and pushed his legs out in front of him just a little bit harder, just a little bit faster. His feet came down not on another rock, but into nothingness. He plunged into deep, cool water. The riverbed had suddenly dropped, and instead of running for his life, he now had to swim. He felt a burst of hope. He was an excellent swimmer. Dion's head came out of the water, and he could see 4 wolves standing on the rocks. 3 of them were pacing back and forth, barking and looking for another rock to jump on that would bring them closer to the boy in the water. The 4th wolf, the largest of them all, was standing still at the rock edge, staring straight at Dion. The river current here was slow, and Dion was still too close to the wolves to feel safe, so he began to swim backwards as best as he could while keeping his head above the water. The biggest wolf never took his eyes off of Dion as the gap between them grew wider. Then the wolf jumped. Dion saw the enormous splash as the large wolf hit the water, and then saw the head of his hunter above the water coming straight toward him. How fast could a wolf swim? Dion did not know. It didn't matter. All that mattered was how fast Dion could swim. He turned and plunged his head into the water and began to take long, powerful strokes with his arms. Dion glided across the surface of the water almost effortlessly. He could hear splashing behind him as the wolf worked hard to catch up to him, but this time it was Dion who had the advantage. He took a moment to stop and look back and saw that the wolf was still coming at him, but now the distance between them was larger than it had been on land. Dion's brain once more rapidly examined the situation he was in. The wolf could swim, and could probably swim for a long time, but not very quickly. Dion could swim quickly, but he probably did not have the same level of endurance as the wolf. Sooner or later he would get tired and start to slow down. If the wolf did not give up before then, Dion would be in trouble. Still, there was no other option. He had to keep swimming. And so he swam. He no longer knew how much time was passing. He didn't stop to look behind him any longer. He simply swam. His only chance of survival was to swim as hard, as fast, and for as long as he could, and pray that it was enough. As the miles went by, he noticed that the river was not quite as wide as it had been before, and the current was getting faster. He was being pulled along now by the river, hopefully toward some place that had people. Enough people to scare off a wolf. He did not even know if the wolf was still behind him, but he was not going to waste a precious second to find out. He had to keep going no matter what. Even if the wolf was gone, the river was still the fastest way to travel out of the woods into someplace safer, someplace with people who could help him get back to his family. The current began to grow even faster. The water was moving so swiftly now that Dion did not even feel the need to use his arms any longer. He just let the water do the work. He could hear nothing but the rushing water, feel nothing but the sun beating down on him. He had no idea how far he had come, but he was certain that he was safe now. Then he heard a bark and felt something clamp down hard onto his foot. Pain shot up his leg, and he pulled his foot back as hard as he could. The pain got a lot worse, and his foot came out of the boot he was wearing. The wolf had caught up to him. Shocked by the pain, Dion was frozen for a moment, and that was all the time the wolf needed to be on top of him. Dion and the wolf both went under the water, the wolf biting viciously at the boy who was using every last ounce of his strength trying to force the wolf away. Dion punched at the wolf's snout, at his eyes, at his throat, anything that might hurt the wolf enough to make it back off, if even for a second. But the wolf had come too far to give up on his prey now, and the water made punching difficult for Dion. Dion's lungs burned. He had to get to the surface, at least for a moment, to get some breath. He used what little strength he had left to push off of the wolf's head and breach the surface of the water. Dion took in a lungful of air and felt the wolf's mouth on his jeans, pulling him under again. Dion knew that it was over now. He was bleeding and exhausted. Against another human, it might have been a fair fight, but a wolf spends its entire life running and fighting. Dion was no match for such raw strength and viciousness. There was a roaring in his head. No, not in his head, he realized. It was all around him. He tried to see what was making the noise, but the wolf had come to the surface as well now and was snapping at him again. Dion was able to avoid the full force of the wolf's bite, but the animal's teeth were still ripping holes in his clothes, arms, and shoulders. Then, Dion found out what the roar was all about. One moment he was staring into the face of his own doom. The next moment he was free-falling through the air. The river had become a waterfall, and neither he nor the wolf had realized what was coming. Dion felt at peace for a moment as he tumbled through the air, weightless and no longer being attacked. Then the reality of the situation came back to him, and he began to panic, waving his arms frantically in the air as if trying to fly or swim back up the waterfall. Dion hit the water at the bottom of the fall, and it felt like he was slamming into concrete. An enormous shock went through his body, rattling every bone and ripping out what little air was left in his lungs. Water closed in above him, but because he had landed nearly flat on his back, he did not sink too deep. A few painful kicks of his legs and his head was above the water again. He could hear shouts all around him. There were people here. He could see their campers and tents surrounding the large pool at the base of the waterfall. Some of them were coming toward him, yelling at him to hold on, that it would be okay soon. Then he remembered the wolf. Dion looked around frantically for the beast that had chased him through wood and water. The sun dazzled in his eyes, and his vision was blurred from water and shock, but he was still able at last to spot his enemy. He was slinking off into the trees on the far side of the pool. Dion could see that the wolf was dragging one of his legs behind him, obviously broken. The wolf had come down on the rocks instead of in the pool. His strong hands began to tug Dion toward the edge of the water. He could not help but think how easily things could have gone the other way. It was only by chance that one had lived. As the panic wore off and the emotions began to flood through his brain, he said farewell to the wolf. Though the wolf was still alive, Dion knew that with a broken leg, his enemy would not have many days left. "Goodbye," he said as the wolf's tail disappeared into the growing shadow of the wood. "And I'm sorry."